My name is Ronak Vyas and this video is a collaboration with Programming Knowledge. In this video, we'll talk about how we can integrate a MongoDB database with a Flask REST API written in Python. So in this video, we will actually integrate or add a local MongoDB database which will be running on a local host server to already pre-written Flask REST API. So let's see how we do that. So first and foremost, to start integrating MongoDB with our Flask REST API, the first thing which you need is MongoDB, of course. So you can download MongoDB from mongodb.com, and if you have a Mac, then you can actually just do a brew install MongoDB community, and you can get it on your machine. Now, the next thing which you want to do is have a client for your MongoDB database. So it's perfectly fine to not use a client. It's not compulsory, but it's very easy to visualize your database when you have a client or a UI client for your database. So for that, I use something called as MongoDB Compass. So Compass is by MongoDB, so it is a UI client for MongoDB database. So I use Compass when I have to actually visualize or see my database in action in real time. So we'll see how that happens. And yeah, so once you have MongoDB and MongoDB Compass, you can get started to integrate your MongoDB database to a Flask REST API written in Python. So let's first run our MongoDB server before we start anything. So in Windows or Linux, there might be a different way to start your server. So you can just Google that. But for Mac, since I'm using a Mac and I have Homebrew, I'll be starting my MongoDB server using Homebrew. So let's do that now. So all I have to do is do a brew services start MongoDB community. So it's really easy to start your server using Mac. And now that it's started, I can shift back to my repository and open the code for my REST API. So I'll give you a very brief explanation of what the REST API does and what is happening in the API, so that we can actually start. Yeah, I think it's loaded. Let's wait for the color to show up. Syntax highlighting, and yeah. So here we have a very simple Flask API written in Python. So the API is of a to-do list, so you can use this API to add tasks to your to-do list. So create the tasks, update the tasks, and delete the tasks. So it is a CRUD API where you can get all the to-do list tasks that you have, you can post them, you can put or update them, and you can delete them. But if you see in this piece of code, our only database is basically a Python dictionary here. So we're not using a concrete database here. We're just having a Python dictionary where we store our values, and the database gets completely, scraped or vanish after you close the server, and when you run it back again, you just have one in it. So we need something concrete, and let's see how we can use a MongoDB database to actually integrate with our to-do list API and develop a fully fledged REST API or a CRUD API. So MongoDB is a NoSQL database where your database or your values are stored in the form of a document. So we'll see what all of that means. And yeah, so let's start integrating MongoDB to our database. So to do that, the first thing which you need is something called as Flask Mongo Engine. So we need a way to actually have our Flask application talk to the MongoDB server. So for that, we have something called as Flask Mongo Engine. So let's install that. We'll do a quick install Flask Mongo Engine. And since I already have it already done, and now that you have it, the next thing which we need to do is basically import a bunch of stuff. So let's start doing that. So before we import something in MongoDB, let's actually import a few things here. So we'll be importing fields and Marshall width. So I'll talk about what these things are. And now let's first import our configurations for MongoDB. So just have a few configurations which we need to actually have our database initialized to MongoDB. So we have our config where we tell that the database which you're going to access is to-do model. So we haven't created this to-do model yet. We'll be doing it using Mongo Compass to show you how easy it is to actually create a database. Next, we have our host. So we are hosting it locally on our on me it's a laptop. So yeah, and the port is 27017. Then we create a MongoDB Mongo Engine object. We initialize it to our Flask application. And now, before we jump on to writing any more code, let's actually create our database and MongoDB. So I'll be using Compass for that. So let's just give it a minute to load. So yeah, while this loads, we can actually start writing our code. So we won't save or run the code, but we can start writing it by the time this initializes. So the next thing which we need to do is have a way for us to map our database or map our Python objects to the database, something called as ORM, Object Relational Mapping. So we need to create a class called as to-do model, which will be inheriting from db.document. And now every object, okay, so one second, yeah. So every object that is made of this to-do model class will be stored as a document inside MongoDB. So let's see what we have as our keys in the key value pair that we're going to store. So first we have is an underscore ID. So underscore ID is given by default to every single document that you create on MongoDB. But this is usually stored as an object ID, which is not the best to read or to understand. So we'll be actually overriding this ID and creating our own integer ID, which is very easy to read and very easy to work with. So let's do that first. So we'll have an int field. Next is our task. So the task is going to be db.string field required equal to true. Did I spell that right? Yeah. And similarly, we're going to have something called as a task summary, which is going to tell you more about the to-do list task. Okay. So this is how we actually link our or map our objects to actual MongoDB documents. So now that we have our compass ready, let's actually start making the to-do model local DB. So once you open MongoDB Compass, you have this as your welcome screen. So since we are running this over locally, we just press connect and we connect to the again this is yeah. Okay, so we have a to-do model and we're going to name the collection as to-do model as well. Press or hit create database. And take some time, but it's worth it. So yeah, let's go inside our to-do models. As you can see, the collection has no data, so let's actually finish writing our code to integrate it, and let's actually add some data into this. So now that we have written our class, now let's talk about how we can interact with the API using MongoDB. So first, let's work with post. So post is how you create a database, or sorry, create a document. So for that, we'll be doing a few changes. So let me just show you this right here. Yeah. So first is a simple post args, so a request parser where you take in the body of the API into arguments. So if you are not familiar with how Flask REST API or request parsers work, you can watch the Flask REST full tutorial, which is available in the channel. The next thing which we want to talk about is creating a to-do object. So we have a to-do model where we pass in the ID as a to-do ID, task as the arguments task, which will be in the body of the post request, and summary. And all we have to do is do a dot save to actually save it in our database. And yeah, it's that easy. And yeah, we do an ID equal to to-do ID. So instead of doing this now, let's actually return the object that we have created. So let's just to do and give a status code back. Yeah, this is how we write a post request to actually get some task from the user and saving it in our database. Just the model.save, object.save, that easy. Next is get. So get is basically how we get our task back from the server to the client. So for that, we just have task equal to do model.objects.get. So we get it by the ID because ID is unique. And if not task, there's no task, then we just abort and say that could not find task with that ID. Yeah, that is it. So it's as simple as doing a get call on the objects inside to do model and getting the to do ID, and we just have the task here. The next thing which we talk about is going to be put, or basically how we update our database or update our documents inside our database. So let's go through every single one of these now. So let me just update it here. And yeah, so again, we parse our arguments, get the arguments back, and then if the user wants to change the task, then we do a get on the to-do ID, and we just do a dot update method call. That's it. So we just do a method, update call, and we pass in the arguments that the user or the client wants to change. So for example, if I want to change only the task of the to-do list document, I just pass in the task arg, and if I want to change summary of the task, then I just pass a summary argument and change the summary directly with just one update command. So yeah, pretty simple, pretty straightforward, nothing complicated here. The next thing which we have is delete. So delete is how you delete the document inside MongoDB. So again, we do a to do model.objects.get underscore ID, created by the ID, and call the delete function, and that's it. We delete our to do list task. We just do something called as task deleted and send a 204, which is for delete. Great. So this is how you write basically or integrate MongoDB with Flask. It's pretty straightforward. Nothing magical here. So we just have very simple APIs. So since we are using Flask Mongo engine, it makes it really easy for us to make CRUD applications. So we just do a get on to do ID, get the task, return it, then do it again. Make an object, do a dot save to save it to the database, do an update, and do a delete. So pretty simple function calls which we have here to integrate our Flask API with MongoDB database. And now we just have to make a few changes here. So let me show you what those changes are. So we had imported fields and marshal with here, right? So now what are fields? So when we return something back to the client, as you can see, we are returning a task, right? And a task here is a to-do model object. So when we return a response back to this client, it has to be serializable or in a serializable format. And the most commonly used serializable format is JSON, which is JavaScript object notation. So we have to make sure that everything that we return is in serializable format. So that is where fields come into the picture. So we create something called a resource fields where we have an ID, task, and summary. So whenever we return a to-do model object, we want it to look like this, and Flask helps us do that with something called as marshal with. So marshal with basically adds this set of rules, resource fields to our uh, methods, and whenever we have that as an annotation, whenever we return an object, it is converted into this form: ID, task, and summary. So this is how we actually use fields and marshal with, a pretty cool feature of Flask RESTful to actually return back our objects in a serializable format. So now that we have our Flask application ready, let's run this and see how this works. So to see whether it's working properly or not, we have Postman, which is going to help us send the request back to the server and see whether it's working or not. So let's run our server first. So we do a Python API.py. we have a server running. Let's see if we have created a to-do model. Yes, we have. And let's do a post to-do /1. Give it a body. This is task 1, and the summary is also task 1. And send the request. Okay, so it doesn't show what you have sent, but when you see the database here, hit refresh, you can see that we've actually added our to-do list task into the database. And it's pretty easy, pretty straightforward to see how this works. So let's do it again. Let's add another one. So let's add task 2, do task 2 and somebody else task 2. Hit send. And now let's see our database again. Hit refresh. And as you can see, we have our task 2 in the MongoDB database as well. So yeah, this is how you integrate a MongoDB database with a Flask REST API. And you use MongoDB and MongoDB Compass as the UI client to actually visualize or see your database in action. So yeah, that was a tutorial on MongoDB integration with Flask. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.